Hey guys, tonight we're going on a little historical field trip. No packing required, just your comfiest PJs. Imagine, if you will, stepping through a swirling, shimmering portal, not into some fantastical realm, but into a meticulously preserved, gloriously inconvenient Victorian house. You push open a heavy, creaking oak door, and the air immediately assaults you. It's not just cool, it's a penetrating, damp chill that seems to seep into your very bones, a far cry from your thermostat-controlled haven. The gas lamps flicker with a weak, yellowish glow, casting long, dancing shadows that make the ornate wallpaper seem to writhe. Dust motes, thick as tiny snowdrifts, shimmer in the meager light, revealing every nook and cranny of this seemingly grand, yet fundamentally uncomfortable dwelling. Your modern, temperature-regulated, perpetually connected self would, quite frankly, probably have a full-blown existential crisis before you even made it to the drawing room. You'd quickly realize that your pampered 21st century body and mind are woefully unprepared for the harsh realities of life before central heating and instant gratification. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you guys are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shiver, pulling your arms around yourself instinctively, a gesture that feels utterly futile against the pervasive cold. The grand entrance hall, with its dark wood paneling and intricate tiled floor, feels more like a mausoleum than a welcoming space. The very air smells different, a peculiar blend of coal smoke, damp wool, and something faintly musty, perhaps from generations of trapped odors. You glance around, trying to spot a radiator, a vent, anything that might suggest warmth, but of course there's nothing. This isn't just a bit chilly. This is the kind of cold that sinks into your marrow and refuses to leave, the kind that makes your fingers ache and your nose run. It's a constant, low-grade discomfort that would become the backdrop to your entire existence here. You notice a thick, plush rug, but even that feels cold underfoot, doing little to insulate from the frigid floorboards beneath. The wallpaper, a dizzying pattern of intertwined ivy and dark florals, seems to absorb what little light there is, making the space feel even more enclosed and oppressive. You run a hand over the cold, smooth surface of a marble console table, and a jolt of icy discomfort shoots up your arm. This house, you quickly learn, is not designed for comfort as you understand it. It's built for display, for status, for enduring the elements rather than conquering them. A mainstream historical fact here is that Victorian houses were notoriously difficult to heat. Their construction often prioritized grand facades and high ceilings over insulation and coal fires in individual rooms, while providing some warmth in localized areas, struggled against the sheer volume of cold air. Imagine trying to heat an entire wing with a single fireplace. It's like trying to warm an ice rink with a match. You'd spend half your life huddled by the hearth, constantly feeding the flames, only to feel a blast of icy air every time someone opened a door or, heaven forbid, a window. A quirky tidbit that might surprise you is that some wealthier Victorians used what were called warming pans, long-handled metal pans filled with hot coals to warm their beds before they got in. Imagine your nightly ritual involving a small, controlled fire in your sheets. It sounds like a recipe for a very smoky awakening, doesn't it? And even then, it was just a temporary reprieve. As for open scholarly debate, historians still argue whether the Victorians simply accepted this level of discomfort as part of life, or if they genuinely believe their methods were adequately heating their homes. Were they truly oblivious, or just exceptionally hardy? You, standing here, are certainly leaning towards the former. The sheer effort involved in staying even moderately warm would be a full-time job. You mentally calculate how many layers of merino wool you'd need, and the number quickly approaches all of them. You're already dreaming of your heated blanket back in the 21st century, a luxury so mundane you probably never even thought about it until now. The promise of central heating, a true revolution, feels impossibly far away. As the first sliver of weak morning light begins to filter through the heavy velvet curtains, you realize with a groan that the chill from the night before has not abated. If anything, it feels even more biting, a persistent clamminess that seems to cling to every surface. You pull yourself from the enormous, cold four-poster bed, the feather mattress offering little in the way of warmth, and the sheer thought of what comes next sends a fresh shiver down your spine. The morning ablutions. Forget your warm, steamy bathroom with its invigorating shower and endless hot water. Here, in the Victorian era, the concept of personal hygiene is different. Very, very different. You trudge into what serves as the washroom, likely a small, unheated space with a porcelain basin and a pitcher of water. The water, predictably, is frigid. There's no turning a tap for instant warmth. If you're lucky, a servant might have brought up a small jug of lukewarm water heated over the kitchen range hours ago. More likely, you're splashing icy water onto your face, a shock to the system that, frankly, feels more like torture than refreshment. You try to imagine your elaborate modern skincare routine, the cleansers, the serums, the moisturizers, and then you look at the single, rough linen towel and the bar of unscented, probably lye-based soap. Your skin already feels tight and dry just thinking about it. Brushing your teeth is another adventure. Forget fluoride and mini freshness. You're likely using a brush made of animal hair boar bristles, perhaps in a tooth powder that might contain anything from charcoal and brick dust to crushed cuttlefish. Imagine scrubbing your teeth with abrasive grit that feels suspiciously like it came from the garden path. The concept of daily flossing or even mouthwash is as alien as a smartphone. Historians still argue whether the Victorians truly understood the link between oral hygiene and overall health, or if they just put up with constant toothaches and bad breath as an unavoidable fact of life. You're pretty sure you'd be seeing the local barber surgeon for a tooth extraction within a week. And then there's the toilet situation. Oh, the toilet situation. No gleaming white ceramic with a powerful flush. If you're lucky enough to be in a more affluent urban dwelling, you might have an indoor water closet, but it's likely a primitive contraption prone to blockages and emitting aromas. More often, especially in less grand homes, you're facing a chamber pot under the bed or a trip to the privy or outhouse in the garden, a cold, drafty shed with a wooden seat over a pit. Imagine, on a frosty morning, having to bundle up just to relieve yourself in the backyard, hoping you don't encounter any unpleasant surprises. It's enough to make you question every moment you've ever taken your indoor plumbing for granted. You'd find yourself holding it in for far longer than is healthy, just to avoid the chilling expedition. A mainstream historical fact is that proper sewage systems were only beginning to be developed and implemented during the Victorian era, largely in response to devastating cholera outbreaks. Before that, waste disposal was haphazard, leading to polluted water sources and widespread disease. It wasn't until the mid to late 19th century that cities like London began to construct the extensive sewer networks that underpin modern sanitation. A quirky tidbit is that some wealthier Victorians had elaborate toilet chairs disguised as regular furniture, allowing for a degree of discretion and perhaps warmth for those late-night needs, though the emptying process was still, shall we say, a hands-on affair for the servants. You'd probably find yourself longing for the simple, functional efficiency of a campground pit toilet. At least it's usually in a dedicated space. The sheer lack of privacy and dignity in basic bodily functions would be a constant, low-level stressor, making you keenly aware of every little modern comfort you've ever ignored. You'd feel perpetually a little bit grimy, no matter how much cold water you splashed. Having braved the icy ordeal of your morning ablutions, a new challenge looms. Breakfast. Your stomach rumbles, accustomed to the quick convenience of toast, cereal, or maybe a smoothie. But here, in the Victorian house, breakfast isn't just a meal. It's a statement, a reflection of the household's status, and for you, a bewildering culinary minefield. You descend the grand, creaking staircase, the faint aroma of coal smoke still clinging to the air, mingling with something else, something savory, yet vaguely unidentifiable. You enter the dining room, A rather formal space even at this early hour, with heavy curtains still partly drawn against the weak morning light. On the large, polished table sits an array of dishes that would make your modern nutritionist weep. There's no light yogurt or whole grain oats in sight. Instead, you're confronted with plates piled high with substantial, often greasy fare. Think bacon, sausages, kidneys, perhaps even a deviled tongue or a cold game pie. These aren't just for the working classes. Even the gentry indulged in hearty, protein-heavy breakfasts, believing they needed the sustenance for a long day of, well, being Victorian. You eye a plate of what looks suspiciously like boiled eggs, but they're nestled next to a towering stack of cold toast and what might be a slice of ham the size of your head. The tea, served from a gleaming silver pot, is strong and black, often with milk and sugar, but a far cry from your artisanal coffee or herbal infusions. The milk, you realize, hasn't been pasteurized. A tiny voice in your head, the one that whispers about food safety regulations, starts screaming. You pour some, hoping for the best, and take a sip. It's comforting in its warmth, at least, but the lingering taste of unidentifiable grease from the air makes it less appealing. Then there's the bread. Thick, often white, and made from heavily processed flour. While it might seem innocuous, the Victorian era was rife with food adulteration. A mainstream historical fact is that unscrupulous bakers would add all sorts of dubious ingredients to their bread to make it whiter or heavier, including alum, chalk, plaster of Paris, and even crushed bones. Imagine, your morning slice might contain a surprising amount of construction material. It makes you rethink that innocent-looking piece of toast. A quirky tidbit is that breakfast cereals, as we know them, were still decades away from widespread popularity. While some early health reformers tinkered with grain-based foods, the idea of a ready-to-eat, sweet, dry breakfast was revolutionary. Your instant oatmeal is a marvel of modern convenience. Here, you're faced with a more labor-intensive and, frankly, heavier start to the day. You try a piece of bacon. It's incredibly salty, probably cured with methods that wouldn't pass muster today, and the fat hasn't been rendered quite as crisply as you'd like. Historians still argue whether the high incidence of digestive complaints among Victorians was due to their diet, the lack of refrigeration, or the widespread food adulteration. You, however, are quite certain it's a terrifying combination of all three. Every bite feels like a gamble. You consider the lack of fresh fruit and vegetables on offer, certainly not in the abundance you're used to, and wonder how long it would be before you developed a nutrient deficiency. You might sneak a piece of fruit if you could find one, but they were often considered an indulgence or simply not available in the fresh, ripe state you're accustomed to. The sheer volume of food, coupled with its questionable provenance, would leave you feeling both overly full and strangely undernourished. You'd already be craving a smoothie and a multivitamin. With a stomach full of dubious bacon and a mouth still tingling from tooth powder, your next major hurdle in surviving this Victorian day presents itself: getting dressed. Forget your stretchy yoga pants, your soft cotton t-shirts, or your conveniently zipped and buttoned jeans. In the Victorian era, clothing was less about personal comfort and more about societal expectation, a complex, multi-layered fortress designed to both display your status and, quite frankly, restrict your every movement. You're faced with an array of fabrics that feel alien to your modern touch: heavy wools, stiff silks, and scratchy linens. For a woman, the sheer volume of undergarments alone would be enough to induce a mild panic attack. First, the chemise, a simple cotton shift. Then, the drawers, which were often open-crotched for convenience. Over that, a corset, the notorious symbol of Victorian fashion. This isn't a gentle Spanx. This is a serious piece of engineering designed to cinch your waist to an alarming degree, reshaping your torso into the desired hourglass silhouette. You'd feel your ribs protesting with every breath, your internal organs gently, or not so gently, rearranged. Lacing it up yourself would be a Herculean task. You'd likely need assistance, enduring the tightening until you could barely manage a shallow gasp. Historians still argue whether the health risks of corsetry were exaggerated or genuinely severe, but you're pretty sure your modern lungs would stage a full-blown rebellion. Above the corset come the petticoats, sometimes several of them adding bulk and shape, often stiffened with horsehair or starched linen. And then, the dress itself. For women, this would typically involve a high neckline, long sleeves, and a voluminous skirt, often trailing on the ground. Imagine trying to navigate stairs, or even just sit down comfortably, with yards of fabric bunched around you and a tightly laced corset compressing your diaphragm. The weight of the clothes alone would be exhausting, leaving you feeling like you're constantly performing a slow-motion weightlifting exercise just by existing. You'd quickly realize why fainting couches were a thing. Sometimes, a lady just needed to lie down after merely getting dressed. For men, while less overtly constricting, the clothing was still far from comfortable by modern standards. You'd be pulling on heavy wool trousers, a starched shirt with a stiff collar that feels like a vice around your neck, and a waistcoat. Then comes the coat, often a frock coat or morning coat, made of thick wool, designed for warmth but also for formality and presenting a rigid silhouette. You'd feel incredibly hot indoors, yet strangely still chilled outdoors due to the pervasive dampness. And let's not forget the accessories. A tie or cravat tied meticulously, often uncomfortably tight, and a top hat, which you'd be expected to wear outdoors, adding an extra layer of cumbersome formality. A mainstream historical fact is that fashion was a powerful indicator of social class in the Victorian era. The more elaborate, multi-layered, and impractical your clothing, the higher your status. The leisure implied by such attire suggested you didn't have to do manual labor. A quirky tidbit is that some dresses, particularly those with crinolines, a rigid, hoop-shaped petticoat, were so wide they made it impossible to walk through standard doorways or sit side by side in carriages. Imagine the daily logistical nightmare. You'd constantly be snagging your skirt on furniture, tripping over your own hems, and generally feeling like a very overdressed, very uncomfortable clown. The simple act of bending down to pick something up would become an acrobatic feat, and the idea of casual wear is utterly laughable. You'd already be dreaming of your softest, loosest pajamas, ready to shed these sartorial shackles. Dressed to impress, or more accurately, to merely exist within the confines of Victorian propriety, you now face the day's activities. And for anyone not blessed with a life of pure leisure, that means work. But forget your ergonomic office chair, your standing desk, or even your electric vacuum cleaner. Housework in a Victorian home was an arduous, relentless, and often hazardous undertaking, designed to break your spirit long before it broke a sweat. You, with your modern sensibilities and reliance on technology, would be utterly flummoxed by the sheer physical labor involved. Imagine trying to clean this grand, dusty house. Every surface is an invitation for dust to settle. Every ornate carving a trap for grime. There's no quick swipe with a microfiber cloth here. Cleaning involved heavy brushes, harsh lye-based soaps, and an endless supply of elbow grease. Floors weren't simply vacuumed. They were swept, scrubbed on hands and knees with buckets of cold, soapy water, and then polished with beeswax. Your back would ache, your knees would protest, and your hand would quickly become raw and chapped. And that's just the floors. Then there are the fires. Remember those beautiful but utterly inefficient coal fires from Section 1? They generate an astonishing amount of soot and ash. Every morning, each fireplace would need to be cleaned out, the ashes removed, a dirty, dusty job, and the fire relit. This isn't just a quick flick of a switch. It involves kindling, coal, and a fair bit of patience and lung power. Imagine doing this for multiple rooms day in and day out. Your lungs, accustomed to filtered air, would quickly protest the constant inhalation of fine coal dust. A mainstream historical fact is that respiratory illnesses, like bronchitis and pneumonia, were rampant among Victorians, partly due to the poor air quality indoors from coal fires and poor ventilation. You'd probably develop a chronic cough within a week. Laundry, oh laundry. Forget your washing machine and dryer. Here, laundry day was an epic, all-day affair, often requiring several people. Clothing was boiled in huge copper coppers over a fire, scrubbed by hand on washboards with harsh lye soap, rinsed repeatedly, wrung out by hand until your forearms screamed, and then hung to dry, often outdoors in all weathers, or draped precariously indoors. Imagine the sheer weight of soaking wet woolens and linens. And then, the ironing, done with heavy cast iron irons heated on the fire or stove. There's no steam setting, no auto shut-off, just pure brute force heat and weight, risking singeing your clothes or more likely your fingers. You'd probably look at your delicate cycle setting with a newfound appreciation. A quirky tidbit that highlights the danger of domestic tasks is the use of arsenic in everyday items. For example, some Victorian wallpapers were dyed with Sheely's green or Paris green, both arsenic-based pigments. As these wallpapers age, the arsenic could flake off or even be released as a toxic gas in damp conditions. So, while you're scrubbing the walls, you might literally be poisoning yourself. Historians still argue whether the Victorians fully grasped the long-term health implications of such common practices, or if the gradual onset of symptoms made them difficult to attribute. You, however, would be acutely aware of every strange smell and odd stain, constantly wondering if it was going to shorten your lifespan. The sheer manual labor, coupled with the hidden dangers, would make you yearn for the effortless hum of your dishwasher and the quiet efficiency of your robot vacuum. You'd quickly realize that clean, in the Victorian sense, meant something entirely different from your sparkling, sanitized home. Having survived the rigorous and somewhat toxic morning rituals of the Victorian household, you might imagine a brief respite. Perhaps a quiet moment to yourself? A quick check of your phone? Not a chance. The Victorian day, particularly for those of a certain social standing, was governed by an intricate web of social expectations and rigid etiquette. Venturing out, even for a simple errand, wasn't just about putting one foot in front of the other. It was a performance, a constant navigation of unspoken rules that would leave your modern, casual self utterly bewildered and perpetually on edge. You step outside, the heavy door closing behind you with a definitive thud. Immediately, the air feels different from your carefully controlled indoor environment, a mix of coal smoke, horse dung, and general urban effluvia. But before you can even properly register the smells, your attention is drawn to the people around you. Everyone seems to have a specific way of walking, of holding themselves, of acknowledging or pointedly ignoring others. There's a silent, elaborate dance happening on the pavement, and you have no idea of the choreography. Take, for example, the simple act of greeting. Forget a casual wave or a quick hey. If you encounter someone you know, the level of formality depends entirely on your respective social statuses, genders, and the nature of your relationship. A gentleman might tip his hat to a lady, but never a full bow unless she was of significantly higher rank. A lady might offer a slight incline of her head, but never extend her hand first to a gentleman unless she was much older or a close relative. The rules around acknowledging someone you'd merely passed yesterday would be incredibly nuanced. Get it wrong, and you could cause offense, create scandal, or simply brand yourself as hopelessly gauche. You'd find yourself overthinking every glance, every potential encounter, constantly worried about committing a social faux pas. It's like living in a constant, low-stakes improv show where you don't know the script. Even conversation had its unwritten laws. Topics considered appropriate for public discourse were limited. Politics, religion, and anything remotely scandalous were generally off-limits in casual settings, especially mixed company. Small talk reigned supreme, but even it had to be handled with care. And direct compliments, particularly from a man to a woman, could be seen as forward or even insulting. You, accustomed to open, frank discussions, would find yourself biting your tongue, resorting to vague pleasantries, and feeling utterly stifled. It's a bit like being at a perpetually awkward family dinner, but with far higher social stakes. A mainstream historical fact is that calling cards were essential tools of Victorian social interaction. Dropping off a card at someone's home was a formal way to initiate or acknowledge a social visit, and the way the card was presented a corner folded, for instance, could convey specific messages without a single word being spoken. Imagine an entire system of communication based on card origami. A quirky tidbit is that the specific placement of a decorative fan for a woman, or the way a gentleman held his cane, could also convey subtle messages. Historians still argue whether these intricate rules genuinely fostered a more polite society or simply created a suffocating environment of performative decorum. You, however, would probably stumble through the day, committing every social sin imaginable, and wondering why everyone seemed to be giving you sideways glances. The pressure to conform, to always be on, would be utterly exhausting. You'd probably just want to go back inside and hide. Having successfully, or perhaps disastrously, navigated the social minefield of Victorian streets, you might think the challenges would subside once you're simply out and about. But no, the very act of existing in a Victorian public space is fraught with an entirely different set of perils, particularly for your tender 21st century constitution. Forget the smooth pavements, the regulated traffic, and the generally clean air you're accustomed to. You're embarking on a walk on the wild side, where the wild is often synonymous with unsanitary and potentially deadly. As you pick your way along the uneven cobblestones, try not to trip over your voluminous skirt or the hem of your frock coat. Your senses are immediately overwhelmed. The air is a noxious cocktail of smells. Horse manure, of course, is ever-present. Horses were the primary mode of transport, and their waste was simply left where it landed to be slowly ground into the street by countless hooves and carriage wheels. This combines with the acrid tang of coal smoke belching from every chimney, the smell of uncollected refuse in gutters, and the faint but persistent odor of raw sewage, especially if you happen to be near one of the still open sewer drains. Your modern nose, accustomed to the relatively sanitized urban air, would be in a constant state of mild revolt. You'd probably find yourself perpetually pinching your nostrils or holding a handkerchief to your face, trying to filter out the onslaught of unpleasantness. Beyond the smells, there's the sheer physical danger. The streets are bustling, but not with neatly organized pedestrian traffic. Hawkers shout their wares, newsboys dart between carriages, and horse-drawn omnibuses rumble past, splashing mud and filth onto unwary pedestrians. There are no traffic lights, no pedestrian crossings, just a chaotic free-for-all. You'd constantly be dodging, weaving, and narrowly avoiding collisions, your nerves frayed by the sheer unpredictability of it all. Imagine trying to cross a busy intersection, not knowing if the next carriage is going to veer suddenly or if a stray dog is going to dart in front of you. Your modern instinct for orderly movement would be utterly useless here. A mainstream historical fact is that disease was rampant in Victorian cities, largely due to overcrowding, poor sanitation, and contaminated water supplies. Cholera, typhus, and smallpox were constant threats, lurking in the very air and water you consumed. Every public surface, every handshake, every breath felt like a potential vector for infection. You'd quickly become a germaphobe, constantly washing your hands with that dubious lye soap if you could find water, and avoiding contact with anything or anyone. A quirky tidbit is that fog in Victorian London was often not natural mist, but a thick, choking smog, a toxic blend of coal smoke and natural fog that could be so dense you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Imagine navigating that while trying to avoid horse dung and carriages. Historians still argue whether the Victorians were truly oblivious to the direct link between their unsanitary conditions and widespread illness, or if they simply lacked the scientific understanding to effectively combat it. You, however, would be making those connections instantly, feeling a prickle of anxiety with every cough you heard, every suspicious puddle you skirted. The vibrant but utterly filthy tapestry of Victorian public life would be a constant assault on your senses and your peace of mind. You'd yearn for the quiet hum of an electric car, the sterile scent of a hospital, and the simple luxury of breathing deeply without fear. The idea of taking a leisurely stroll would be a distant, impossible dream. After navigating the olfactory and physical hazards of the Victorian streets, you might find yourself longing for the relative safety of the indoors. But what happens when, inevitably, the unsanitary conditions and constant exposure to new pathogens finally catch up to your delicate modern immune system? You feel a tickle in your throat, a general malaise settling over you, and then the dreaded Victorian cough begins. Welcome to the terrifying realm of Victorian medicine, where a simple sniffle could escalate into a life-threatening ordeal, and the cures often felt worse than the disease itself. Your first inclination, of course, would be to reach for a paracetamol, an ibuprofen, or perhaps some cold and flu tablets. Here, not a chance. Pain relief, as we know, it is a distant dream. Instead, you'd likely be offered concoctions that sound less like medicine and more like ingredients for a witch's brew. Imagine being prescribed a dose of laudanum, a potent, often addictive, opium-based tincture for a headache. While effective at numbing pain, it came with significant risks of addiction and overdose. A mainstream historical fact is that opium derivatives were widely available and unregulated throughout the Victorian era, leading to widespread addiction, even among respectable ladies and children. You'd be battling not just your illness, but also the very real possibility of dependence on your cure. If your condition worsened, a doctor might be called. And what a doctor! Forget the sterile, evidence-based practices of modern medicine. Victorian doctors, while well-intentioned, operated with a limited understanding of germ theory and often relied on treatments that were at best ineffective, at worst, actively harmful. Bloodletting, for instance, though declining, was still practiced by some. The idea of deliberately draining blood from your already weakened body just sounds like something out of a horror film, doesn't it? Then there were purgatives designed to cleanse the body by inducing severe vomiting or diarrhea. You'd be wishing for the simple luxury of a stomach bug and a comforting rehydration sachet. A quirky tidbit that highlights the strangeness of Victorian remedies is the widespread belief in the power of quack medicines. Patent medicines, often aggressively marketed, promised cures for everything from consumption to melancholy, but frequently contain high levels of alcohol, opium, or even cocaine, making them addictive placebos rather than genuine treatments. You could buy a bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for your crying child, unaware it contained morphine. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of these patent medicines reflected a genuine lack of medical knowledge or a public desperation for any kind of relief in an era of high mortality rates. You, however, will be keenly aware of the gamble involved with every dose, wondering if this cure would actually make you sicker. The lack of sanitation in hospitals, if you were unlucky enough to end up in one, was another terrifying reality. Before the widespread adoption of antiseptic practices championed by figures like Joseph Lister, surgical instruments were rarely sterilized, and doctors often moved from examining one patient to performing surgery on another without washing their hands. The risk of contracting a secondary infection in a hospital was incredibly high, often proving fatal. You'd find yourself clinging to the hope of recovering at home, away from such dubious medical interventions. Every ache, every sneeze, every slight fever would fill you with dread, knowing that your usual arsenal of remedies was gone, replaced by a terrifying uncertainty and the potential for bizarre, dangerous cures. You'd yearn for the quiet reassurance of a modern doctor's office and the miracle of a simple antibiotic. Having perhaps narrowly escaped the clutches of a Victorian doctor and their questionable remedies, you might feel the need for some distraction. Your modern brain, however, is wired for instant gratification. Streaming services, video games, social media, a quick trip to the cinema. But in the Victorian house, entertainment is a vastly different beast, often requiring more effort than enjoyment, and sometimes surprisingly dangerous. Imagine an evening stretches out before you, dark and long without the glow of your phone or TV. What do? Reading, of course, is a popular pastime, but often by dim gaslight, which would strain your eyes. And the books themselves are different, often long, dense novels printed in small type, a far cry from your quickly digestible articles and endless feeds. Perhaps you pick up a musical instrument. The piano is a common feature in many Victorian homes. But this isn't a quick strum of a ukulele. It involves sheet music, hours of practice, and the pressure of potentially performing for guests. You'd likely feel more like you were back in a school recital than genuinely relaxing. Then there are the parlor games. Forget charades or Monopoly. Victorian parlor games could be surprisingly elaborate and sometimes physically demanding. Think of Postman's Knock, a kissing game played by adults, which would make your modern self blush. Or Are You There, Moriarty? A blindfolded game where participants try to hit each other with rolled-up newspapers. Imagine the potential for accidental injury. A quirky tidbit is the popularity of Magic Lantern shows a precursor to modern cinema where hand-painted glass slides were projected onto a wall, often accompanied by live narration and music. While charming, it required a significant setup and wasn't exactly binge-watching Netflix. A mainstream historical fact is that public entertainment options like theater and music halls grew immensely popular during the Victorian era, offering a vibrant, if sometimes raucous, escape from daily life. But these weren't casual outings. Attending required appropriate dress, purchasing tickets, and enduring potentially long, crowded journeys in uncomfortable carriages. And the performances themselves, while grand, could be incredibly lengthy. You wouldn't just pop in for a quick matinee. You were in for an entire evening. Historians still argue whether the Victorians genuinely enjoyed the prolonged formality of their entertainment or if it was simply a societal expectation. You, however, would probably be fidgeting in your seat, checking your imaginary watch, and wondering when you could discreetly slip away for a quick peek at your phone. Even hobbies could be intense. Photography, for instance, existed, but it was a laborious process involving chemicals, long exposures, and heavy equipment, a far cry from your instant smartphone snaps. You couldn't just point and shoot. Collecting, too, was a serious pursuit, from stamps to butterflies, often involving meticulous organization and display. The pace of life was simply slower, and entertainment reflected that. There was no escaping into a digital world. You were always acutely present in your physical surroundings, for better or worse. You'd quickly realize how much your modern leisure time relies on passive consumption and instant access, making Victorian pastimes feel like monumental endeavors rather than simple relaxation. You'd probably just want to lie down and stare at the ceiling, dreaming of your favorite comfort show. As the day draws to a close, a new set of challenges arises, culminating in the grand spectacle that is the Victorian dinner. Forget your quick microwave meal or your relaxed takeout on the sofa. Dinner in a Victorian house, especially one of any social standing, was an elaborate, multi-course affair governed by strict rules of etiquette, served in an environment that often felt more formal than convivial, and presenting you with a dizzying array of dishes, some of which would make your modern palate recoil. You descend once more to the dining room, but this time it's transformed. The gas lights are lit, perhaps even supplemented by flickering candles, casting a warm but still somewhat dim glow over the heavy mahogany table. Gleaming silverware and crystal glasses are meticulously arranged, each for a specific purpose you can barely fathom. You take your seat, keenly aware of every movement, every rustle of your heavy clothing. The pressure to maintain composure and adhere to the unspoken rules is palpable. This isn't just a meal, it's a performance. The meal itself is a marathon. Unlike your typical modern dinner with one or two main courses, Victorian dinners often featured multiple removes, entire new sets of dishes brought to the table. You might start with soup, move on to fish, then several meat courses, roasts, poultry game, accompanied by various vegetables, then perhaps a savory, before finally reaching the sweet desserts. The sheer volume of food is staggering, far more than any reasonable person could consume. A mainstream historical fact is that this excessive display of food was a direct indicator of wealth and hospitality. The more abundant and varied the spread, the higher the host's status. You'd find yourself struggling to keep up, politely declining portions you couldn't possibly finish, and try to remember which fork to use for which course. It's like a culinary obstacle course. And the food itself? While some dishes might be recognizable, others would be utterly alien. Imagine being presented with turtle soup, or perhaps a stuffed boar's head. Sauces were often heavy, rich, and sometimes spiced in ways unfamiliar to modern tastes. The concept of balanced nutrition or light, fresh ingredients was secondary to richness and quantity. A quirky tidbit is the popularity of aspic savory jelly dishes often containing meat, fish, or eggs artfully arranged and molded. Imagine a cold, wobbly fish suspended in gelatin. It makes your modern Jell-O look positively gourmet. Historians still argue whether the Victorians genuinely enjoyed the taste of all these elaborate dishes or if much of it was purely for show. You, however, would probably be picking at your plate, discreetly pushing aside anything too adventurous and dreaming of simple salad. The conversation, too, would be formal. Small talk about pleasantries, art, or travel would be acceptable, but never anything controversial or overly personal. The expectation was to engage politely, avoid offending anyone, and generally maintain a veneer of civilized decorum. You'd probably find yourself struggling to contribute, your modern conversational habits feeling far too direct or informal. Every clink of a fork, every sip of wine, which would be served liberally, would echo in the room, making you acutely aware of your presence. By the time dessert arrived, often equally elaborate puddings, jellies, and pastries, you'd be utterly stuffed, exhausted by the social performance, and yearning for the quiet comfort of your own modern kitchen. The sheer formality and overwhelming abundance of a Victorian dinner would leave you feeling more drained than satisfied. As the elaborate dinner finally concludes, and the last crumbs of an overly sweet pudding are cleared, the gentle glow of gaslight begins to feel less charming and more like a feeble attempt to hold back the encroaching darkness. The evening chill, a persistent companion since your arrival, starts to settle in with a vengeance, wrapping the Victorian house in an even deeper, more pervasive cold. Your internal thermostat, calibrated for a comfortable 22 degrees Celsius, would be screaming in protest. You might retreat to the drawing room, hoping for a bit of warmth by the fireplace. But even here, with a roaring fire, the heat radiates only a few feet, leaving the rest of the vast room shrouded in a cool, damp air. You can feel the drafts seeping in from under the ill-fitting doors and through the ornate, single-paned windows. No double glazing here, no modern insulation tucked neatly within the walls. The very structure of the house seems designed to exchange heat with the outdoors as efficiently as possible, but in the wrong direction. You find yourself instinctively rubbing your arms, shifting in your seat to try and find a warmer spot, a futile dance against the pervasive chill. The heavy velvet curtains, while beautiful, do little to stop the cold radiating from the glass. You might notice little draft excluders, long, fabric-covered tubes placed at the bottom of doors, a testament to the constant battle against the cold. But these are mere cosmetic fixes for a fundamental architectural flaw. The air feels heavy, carrying the lingering scent of coal smoke from the various fireplaces and perhaps a hint of the dampness from the walls themselves. You'd find yourself constantly aware of the temperature, an annoying background hum of discomfort that would slowly chip away at your patience. A mainstream historical fact is that many Victorians wore multiple layers of clothing indoors, even a bed, simply to cope with the lack of effective heating. Nightcaps, thick dressing gowns, and even special bed socks were common, not as fashion statements, but as necessary tools for survival against the cold. You'd probably find yourself eyeing the thickest blanket in the room, wondering if it would be socially acceptable to just wrap yourself in it like a giant human burrito. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates the Victorians' ingenuity in the face of cold is the foot muff, a small, often fur-lined bag designed to keep your feet warm while sitting. Imagine needing a specially designed accessory just to keep your toes from freezing indoors. Historians still argue whether the Victorians truly perceived their homes as warm, or if they simply adapted their bodies and habits to a level of cold that we would find intolerable. You, however, are quite certain they were simply made of sterner stuff, or perhaps just too polite to complain. Every time you shift in your chair, or feel a particularly biting draft on your ankle, you'd be reminded that this house is actively working against your comfort. The desire for a modern, perfectly tempered home, where you can walk around in a t-shirt in January, would become an almost obsessive yearning. You'd be plotting your escape back to a world of central heating and instant warmth. As the evening deepens and the cold becomes a truly oppressive presence, your thoughts inevitably turn to sleep. But here, in the Victorian house, even the simple act of preparing for bed is a multi-step, often uncomfortable ritual, far removed from your modern routine of simply slipping into pajamas and hopping under a duvet. The idea of a warm, inviting bed is a distant fantasy. Instead, you're preparing for another battle against the chill. First, there's the undressing. Those layers of heavy, restrictive clothing you struggled into this morning now need to come off, a tedious process in the dim, cold bedroom. You pull off the heavy dress or suit coat, then the waistcoat, the stiff shirt, and for a woman, the multiple petticoats, and finally the corset. As the corset comes off, you gasp, not just from the relief of being able to breathe properly, but from the sudden rush of cold air against your now unrestricted skin. It's a trade-off, comfort for warmth, and in a Victorian bedroom, warmth is almost always losing. You'd probably shiver violently as each layer is removed, rushing to put on your night clothes. And what night clothes they are! Forget flimsy silk or soft cotton. Victorian nightwear, particularly in colder months, was designed for maximum coverage and warmth, but often lacked the luxurious feel you're accustomed to. You'd likely be donning a thick flannel nightgown or nightshirt, perhaps even with long sleeves and a high neck, designed to trap what little body heat you could generate. Then, of course, the obligatory nightcap, not just a cute accessory, but a practical necessity to prevent heat loss from your head. Imagine going to bed looking like a Dickensian ghost, swathed in layers of heavy fabric, your head comically topped with a pointy hat. Then comes the bed itself. It's grand, perhaps a four-poster with heavy drapes, which might offer a modicum of enclosure from the drafts. But the sheets are cold, perhaps even damp feeling from the pervasive chill of the room. Remember those warming pans from Section 1? Now, more than ever, you wish one had been prepared for you. Without it, you're faced with the shocking plunge into icy linen, a feeling that would make you curl into a tight ball, shivering uncontrollably for what feels like an eternity until your body heats slowly, grudgingly, warms a small pocket around you. Your electric blanket seems like a divine invention in comparison. A mainstream historical fact is that many Victorians slept with multiple heavy blankets and duvets made of wool or down, layered to provide as much insulation as possible against the biting cold. The sheer weight of these coverings would be substantial. A quirky tidbit is the concept of bed curtains or testers on four-poster beds, which weren't just decorative. They were designed to be drawn tightly around the bed, creating a smaller, warmer microclimate, somewhat like a tent within the room, to trap body heat and keep drafts out. Historians still argue whether this elaborate ritual genuinely provided restful sleep, or if the Victorians simply accepted perpetual discomfort as part of their nightly routine. You, however, would be utterly exhausted by the mere preparation for sleep, your modern desire for effortless comfort completely unfulfilled. The thought of crawling into that icy expanse, knowing you'd be fighting the cold all night, would fill you with a profound sense of dread. You'd be longing for your softest, fluffiest comforter and the simple warmth of a preheated room. You've finally managed to bundle yourself into your formidable nightwear, brave the icy embrace of the bed sheets, and slowly, painstakingly, begun to generate a small, pathetic pocket of warmth beneath your mountain of blankets. But don't think for a moment that sleep in a Victorian house is a peaceful, uninterrupted affair. Even in the depths of night, your modern sensibilities would be assaulted by a symphony of surprising and often unsettling disturbances, making a good night's rest feel like an impossible luxury. First, there's the noise. Your quiet, well-insulated bedroom is a far cry from the auditory reality of a Victorian home. The house itself would groan and creak, settling in the cold, the wood contracting with audible snaps and pops. Outside, the sounds of the city, unfiltered by modern soundproofing, would drift through the windows. The distant clip-clop of a horse and carriage on the cobblestones, the plaintive cries of a night watchman, or even the raucous shouts of late-night revelers or early-morning vendors. You'd also hear every sound within the house, the murmur of servants stirring in the early hours, the shifting of other residents, the subtle plink of water pipes if you were fortunate enough to have them, or worse, the scurrying of unwelcome guests. Imagine trying to fall asleep with a constant, low-level cacophony of unfamiliar sounds, some of them rather unsettling. And speaking of unwelcome guests, vermin were a common problem in Victorian homes, even in wealthier ones. Mice and rats, drawn by food scraps and the warmth of the structure, would often make their presence known through scratching and skittering sounds in the walls and floorboards. The thought of rodents sharing your living space, let alone scurrying near your bedroom, would be enough to send shivers down your spine, and not just from the cold. A mainstream historical fact is that pest control, as we know, it was rudimentary, and infestations were a common reality of daily life. You'd probably spend a good portion of the night listening intently, hoping the sounds weren't getting any closer to your bed. Then there's the air itself. Remember the coal fires? Even if they're banked for the night, the air quality inside the house would be far from pristine. The lingering smell of smoke, the dampness, and a lack of fresh air circulation would likely lead to a stuffy, oppressive atmosphere. If you manage to doze off, you might be awakened by a sudden chill as the fire in the grate finally died down, or by the need to relieve yourself. And of course, the thought of having to get out of your carefully warmed bed and face the cold trip to the chamber pot or the outdoor privy would be enough to make you try and hold it in until dawn, leading to a restless, uncomfortable sleep. A quirky tidbit that reflects the unusual sleep habits of the era is the concept of first sleep and second sleep, especially in earlier Victorian times. Before artificial lighting became widespread, many people would go to bed shortly after dusk, wake up in the middle of the night for an hour or two to read, pray, or even socialize, and then return to bed for a second sleep until dawn. Historians still argue whether this segmented sleep pattern was a societal norm driven by practicalities or a natural human sleep rhythm. You, however, would simply be longing for continuous, uninterrupted 8 hours, free from creepy crawlies and chilling expeditions to the loo. Your body, accustomed to deep, unbroken sleep cycles, would be in utter rebellion against these constant disturbances, leaving you feeling perpetually exhausted, even after a full night in a Victorian bed. Every bump in the night would feel magnified, and the idea of truly restful slumber would remain elusive. After a night of shivering, listening to unseen critters, and perhaps even experiencing a fragmented sleep, dawn arrives not as a welcome herald of a new day, but as a chilling reminder that the cycle of Victorian discomfort is perpetual. The first weak rays of light that struggle through the heavy curtains only serve to illuminate the cold, dusty reality of your surroundings, and your modern self feels an immediate wave of fatigue and dread. There's no hit of caffeine waiting, no comforting morning routine to ease you into consciousness. You slowly extract yourself from the cold embrace of the bed, each movement an effort. The flannel nightgown, once a bastion against the cold, now feels merely cumbersome. The air in the room is stale and damp, a stark contrast to the fresh, often air-conditioned, environment you're accustomed to waking up in. Your muscles ache from the cold and the unfamiliar rigidity of the bed, and your head feels fuzzy from the disturbed sleep. You're already tired, and the day has barely begun. This isn't the refreshed feeling you get after a night in your own bed. It's the dull throb of persistent exhaustion. The immediate priorities of the day quickly reassert themselves, each at shore. The call of nature, still uncomfortably pressing, means another frigid journey to the privy or the unpleasant use of the chamber pot. Then, the prospect of splashing icy water on your face, followed by the rigorous process of donning those layers of restrictive clothing all over again. The thought of lacing up that corset or buttoning that stiff collar send a shiver through you that has nothing to do with the temperature. You'd find yourself actively procrastinating, lingering in the dubious warmth of the bed for as long as possible, knowing the discomfort that awaits you. A mainstream historical fact is that the average life expectancy in Victorian Britain was significantly lower than today, often in the 40s or early 50s, due to a combination of poor sanitation, widespread disease, harsh working conditions, and inadequate medical care. While you might not die in 24 hours, the cumulative effect of constant exposure to these conditions would undoubtedly take its toll on your long-term health. A quirky tidbit, perhaps a small comfort in this bleak outlook, is that the morning tea service was a vital ritual for many Victorians, often involving a light breakfast brought directly to the bedroom, offering a small reprieve from the cold and the immediate demands of the day. You'd probably cling to the idea of that hot cup of tea like a lifeline. Historians still argue whether the Victorians genuinely possessed a greater fortitude for discomfort than modern humans, or if their constant exposure simply dulled their perception of hardship. You, however, are experiencing it firsthand, and you're pretty sure your modern, comfort-seeking body would stage a full-blown mutiny. The sheer grind of daily life, the relentless cold, the lack of modern conveniences, and the ever-present threat of illness would combine to create a pervasive sense of low-grade anxiety and physical depletion. The thought of facing another 24 hours, let alone an entire lifetime, in this environment would be utterly overwhelming. The quiet hum of your modern refrigerator, the instant warmth of your central heating, the simple luxury of a genuinely clean bathroom, all these mundane realities of your own time would call to you with an irresistible siren song. This wasn't just a brief inconvenience. This was the very fabric of daily existence, and you were decidedly not built for it. So, you've made it through the day, or rather, this simulated journey through the endless discomforts of a Victorian house. As you stand there, shivering in your layers of cumbersome clothing, your stomach churning from questionable breakfast meats, your hands raw from attempting to scrub a floor, and your mind reeling from the constant social pressures and the ever-present threat of disease, a profound realization washes over you. Your modern life, with all its mundane conveniences and unspoken assumptions of comfort, has utterly spoiled you. And honestly, thank goodness for that. You picture your sleek, brightly lit kitchen with its humming appliances, the effortless rush of hot water from your shower, the soft embrace of your clean, comfortable bed. You think of your smartphone, connecting you instantly to a world of information and entertainment, a world where warmth is a given and cleanliness is expected. These aren't luxuries you consciously consider in your daily life, but they are the bedrock of your well-being, the invisible infrastructure that makes your existence not just tolerable, but genuinely pleasant. The stark reality of the Victorian house, with its constant cold, its pervasive smells, its laborious routines, and its genuine health hazards, has laid bare just how fundamentally unprepared you are for a life without these modern miracles. The very concept of privacy, of personal space, of effortless sanitation is alien here. You wouldn't last 24 hours not because you lack courage or strength, but because your entire being, from your pampered skin to your technologically attuned brain, is simply not calibrated for this level of relentless inconvenience and physical hardship. You'd be perpetually uncomfortable, constantly anxious about illness, and utterly exhausted by the sheer effort required for basic survival. Your mind, used to processing information at lightning speed and expecting immediate solutions, would be overwhelmed by the slow, manual, and often inefficient processes of the past. The thought of needing a horse to get across town, or waiting days for a letter, or having to heat every bucket of bathwater would feel like an absurd, dystopian nightmare. A mainstream historical fact is that the rapid advancements in technology, sanitation, and medicine that began in the late Victorian era and continued into the 20th century were not just incremental improvements, but fundamental shifts that radically transformed human life, largely eradicating the very discomforts you've experienced. A quirky tidbit is that even the simple zipper, invented in the late 19th century, but popularized much later, would have revolutionized Victorian dressing, sparing countless hours of buttoning, lacing, and hooking. Historians still argue whether the cumulative impact of these small innovations or a few major breakthroughs had the greater effect on improving daily life. You, however, are now unequivocally on the side of the cumulative small ones, appreciating every single effortless convenience. As the phantom chill of the Victorian house begins to recede, replaced by the familiar comfort of your own room, you take a deep, grateful breath. The smell of clean air, the ambient quiet, the warmth, the knowledge that a soft, comfortable bed awaits these are not just trivial details. They're the quiet, unsung heroes of your modern existence. The reasons why you wouldn't last a day in that grand, inconvenient, and utterly fascinating past. You are in essence a creature of comfort, a product of progress. And that, my friends, is absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. Now, as the echoes of that long-ago world fade, let your mind drift from the damp chill of Victorian manor. Feel the soft weight of your own blankets settling around you. The gentle hum of your modern world, a comforting lullaby. Let any lingering tension ease from your shoulders, your breathing softening, slowing. The warmth of your room is a quiet embrace, holding you safely in the present, far from drafts and dimly lit corners. As your eyelids grow heavy, feel yourself sink deeper into the gentle comfort of your bed. The day is done, the history lesson complete, and now, only peaceful rest awaits.